My name is Cynthia Thompson, but everyone calls me Cindy, and I thought I knew every corner of heartbreak, until last Tuesday morning when I discovered that the son I'd grieved for 20 years was not only alive, but living just 3 states away. The man I trusted with my deepest pain, my husband of 25 years, had orchestrated the most devastating lie of my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was organizing the spare bedroom closet, something I'd been putting off for months, when I knocked over an old shoebox that tumbled from the top shelf. Wedding photos scattered across the hardwood floor, along with hospital bracelets, theater tickets, and other fragments of our early marriage. But there, wedged between 2 yellowed newspaper clippings, was an envelope with my name written in my husband Richard's careful handwriting. The paper felt crisp, newer than everything else in the box, and when I opened it, my world shattered completely. Inside was a recent school report card for a boy named Michael Sullivan, age 20, with grades that showed he was studying engineering at a community college in Ohio. Clipped to the report card was a photograph of a young man with dark hair and green eyes that looked exactly like mine when I was his age. At the bottom of the photo, someone had written Mikey, sophomore year in blue ink. My hands started shaking so violently that I dropped the envelope, and everything inside scattered across the floor again. 20 years ago, I gave birth to a baby boy we named Michael, and 3 days later, Richard told me he had died from complications I was too sedated to understand. I never got to hold him, never got to say goodbye. Richard handled everything while I was recovering. The funeral arrangements, the burial, even the paperwork. He said it was too painful for me to see, that I needed to focus on healing. For 2 decades, I visited what I thought was my son's grave every year on his birthday, laying flowers on a headstone that read, Michael Thompson, beloved son, too beautiful for earth. Richard would stand beside me, his hand on my shoulder, as I cried for the child I'd lost. He would comfort me through the waves of grief that still hit me on random Tuesdays, or when I saw other mothers with their grown sons. He knew exactly what to say, exactly how to hold me, because he had watched me break apart over a lie he had created. I sat on the bedroom floor for what felt like hours, staring at that report card and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The dates lined up perfectly. This Michael would have been born the same year as my son, and the resemblance was unmistakable, but it was impossible. I had been there in the hospital. I had felt the emptiness when they told me he was gone. I had signed papers, hadn't I? But as I tried to remember those first few days after the birth, I realized how little I actually recall. I had been on strong medication for the emergency cesarean section, and the whole experience felt hazy and distant, like something that had happened to someone else. Richard had been my anchor through all of it, making decisions when I couldn't, protecting me from details that would have been too much to bear. Now I wondered if he had been protecting me from the truth, or protecting himself from what he had done. I spent the rest of that morning sitting on the closet floor, going through every piece of paper in that shoebox with the methodical precision of someone trying to solve a murder. There were bank statements I'd never seen before, showing regular payments to something called Guardian Family Services, dating back 20 years. There were letters addressed to Richard from lawyers I didn't recognize, discussing ongoing arrangements and monthly stipend. There was even a Christmas card from 2019, with a photo of the same young man, older now, standing next to an older couple in front of a Christmas tree. The card was signed Love, Michael and the Sullivans. Inside, someone had written, "Thank you for everything you've done for our family. Michael is thriving in his engineering program and sends his gratitude." I felt like I was reading about someone else's life, some parallel universe where my dead son was alive and well, and sending Christmas cards to my husband. The betrayal was so enormous that my mind kept trying to reject it, to find some reasonable explanation that didn't require me to believe that Richard had stolen my child and let me grieve for him for 20 years. But the evidence was overwhelming. Every piece of paper told the same story. Somehow Richard had arranged for our son to be given to another family, the Sullivans, and had been financially supporting them ever since. He had let me believe our baby was dead while he watched me visit an empty grave year after year, crying for a child who was growing up somewhere else, calling other people mom and dad. I thought about every birthday I had spent in bed, too depressed to function, every Mother's Day that felt like a knife in my chest, every time I had apologized to Richard for not being able to give him children, not knowing that we had a son who was just a phone call away. He had comforted me through grief that he had manufactured, had held me while I cried tears that he had caused. When I heard Richard's car pull into the driveway that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table with all the papers spread out in front of me. I had spent the day moving between rage and disbelief, and by the time he walked through the front door, I felt completely empty. He called out his usual greeting, asking how my day had been, and I could hear him hanging up his coat in the hallway. When he walked into the kitchen and saw me sitting there with the evidence of his 20-year deception, laid out like a crime scene, his face went completely white. He stopped in the doorway, his briefcase still in his hand, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "Cindy," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can explain." I looked up at him, this man I had shared a bed with for 25 years, and realized I had never really known him at all. "Can you?" I asked. "Can you explain how our son has been alive all this time while I've been visiting an empty grave?" He set his briefcase down slowly and pulled out the chair across from me, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Don't sit down," I said. "Don't make yourself comfortable. Just tell me the truth." Richard stood there looking older than I'd ever seen him, his shoulders sagging like he was carrying a weight he'd been hiding for decades. "He wasn't supposed to live," he said quietly. "The doctors said there were complications, that he might have severe disabilities, that it would be better." "Better for who?" I interrupted. "Better for you, because it certainly wasn't better for me." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I had once found endearing and now found infuriating. "You were so young, Cindy. We were both so young. I thought I was protecting you from a lifetime of struggling with a special needs child." The Sullivans were specifically looking for a baby like Michael. They had experience with children who needed extra care, and they could give him opportunities we couldn't afford. "What disabilities?" I asked. "What was so terrible that you decided to steal my child and let me think he was dead?" Richard looked down at his hands. "A heart murmur," he said. "Some developmental delays. The doctors said he might need multiple surgeries, special schools, constant medical attention." I stared at him in complete silence for a long moment, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest. "A heart murmur," I repeated. "You took my son away from me because of a heart murmur." "It was more complicated than that," he said quickly. "There were other factors, financial considerations." "Financial considerations," I said, my voice getting louder. "You sold our son." "I didn't sell him," Richard said, his face flushing red. "The Sullivans agreed to cover his medical expenses and education in exchange for taking full responsibility for his care. It was an arrangement that benefited everyone. Everyone except me. Everyone except your wife, who spent 20 years thinking her only child was dead." Richard finally sat down without asking permission, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. "I was going to tell you," he said. "So many times over the years, I wanted to tell you the truth. But as time went on it got harder. You were so devastated by his death, and I thought if I told you he was alive but you could never see him, it would destroy you completely. So instead you destroyed me slowly," I said. "Year by year, birthday by birthday. You let me grieve a lot." "I thought I was protecting you," he said again. But even he seemed to realize how hollow that sounded now. I picked up the Christmas card and held it out to him. "This is from 2 years ago." Michael was 18 years old enough to make his own decisions about whether he wanted to meet his birth mother. "But you never told him about me, did you?" Richard's silence was answer enough. "Does he know I exist?" I asked. "The Sullivans told him he was adopted," Richard said quietly. "But they said his birth parents had died in an accident." The room went completely quiet except for the sound of the refrigerator humming, and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "My son thought I was dead. For 20 years, he had been living his life believing that his birth parents were gone, just like I had been living my life believing he was gone. Richard had managed to make us both orphans in each other's lives." "Get out," I said quietly. Cindy, please. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Let me explain. Get out of my house, I said, louder this time. Get out of my house, and don't come back until I decide what I'm going to do about this. Richard stood up slowly, looking like he wanted to say something else, but I picked up the phone from the counter and held it in my hand. I'm calling the police if you're not gone in 5 minutes, I said. He left without another word, and I listened to his car start up and drive away before I finally let myself fall apart. I sat at that kitchen table and cried harder than I had since the day I thought my son died, but this time I was crying for all the years I had lost, all the moments that had been stolen from both of us, all the ways Richard had betrayed not just me but Michael too. When I finally stopped crying, I looked at that report card again, and realized that I didn't just want answers, I wanted my son back, and I was going to find a way to get him, no matter what it took or how much damage it did to the life Richard had built on his lie. I spent that first night alone in the house, calling in sick to work and researching everything I could find about guardian family services, private adoptions, and the legal rights of birth parents who had been deceived. What I discovered made me even angrier. In most states, adoptions that involved fraud or coercion could be challenged, especially if one parent had not given genuine informed consent. I had never consented to give up my son. I had been told he was dead. That wasn't consent. That was theft. By morning, I had filled a notebook with phone numbers for family lawyers, private investigators, and advocacy groups for parents who had been victimized by illegal adoption practices. I also had the address for the Sullivans' house in Ohio, which I'd found through a combination of social media searching and public records databases. For the first time in 20 years, I had a plan that didn't involve crying over a grave. Richard came back the next evening while I was making dinner, letting himself in with his key like nothing had changed. He found me in the kitchen, standing at the stove stirring a pot of soup, and he seemed surprised that I wasn't crying or throwing things at him. I've been thinking about what you said, he started, but I cut him off without turning around. I've hired a lawyer, I said calmly. I'm challenging the adoption on the grounds of fraud and deception. Cindy, you can't do that, he said, his voice taking on a panicked edge. It would destroy Michael's life. The Sullivans are his family now. They've raised him, they love him, and whose fault is that? I asked, finally turning to face him. Whose fault is it that my son doesn't know who I am? Richard sat down heavily at the table. The lawyer fees alone will bankrupt us, he said, and even if you win, what then? You can't just show up in Michael's life after 20 years and expect him to welcome you with open arms. You'll traumatize him. More than finding out his father lied to him about his birth parents being dead, I asked. More than discovering that his real mother has been alive all this time, grieving for him. Richard didn't have an answer for that. I'm not trying to destroy his relationship with the Sullivans, I continued, but he has a right to know the truth. He has a right to know that I exist, that I never wanted to give him up, that I've been looking for him his whole life without knowing he was alive to be found. What if he doesn't want to meet you? Richard asked quietly. It was the question I'd been asking myself all night, the fear that had kept me awake staring at the ceiling. What if I found my son only to discover that he wanted nothing to do with me? What if 20 years with the Sullivans had given him a complete life that didn't have room for a birth mother who was essentially a stranger? Then at least he'll have the choice, I said. At least he'll know the truth and be able to decide for himself instead of living a lie that you created for him. Richard looked defeated, older than his 53 years, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered the Christmas card, the report card, all the evidence that he had been in contact with our son while letting me believe he was dead, and the anger came flooding back. I want you out of the house, I said. Tonight, until this is resolved, I don't want to see you. Cindy, this is my house too, he said. We can work through this together, as a family. We stopped being a family the day you decided to steal my son, I said. Pack a bag and go stay with your brother, or get a hotel room, or sleep in your car, I don't care, but you're not sleeping here. Richard left that night with a suitcase full of clothes and a wounded expression that he probably thought would make me feel guilty. It didn't. If anything, I felt relief. For the first time in 20 years, I was sleeping in a house that didn't contain the man who had orchestrated the worst betrayal of my life. Over the next week, I threw myself into the legal process with an intensity that surprised my lawyer, Janet Morrison, who specialized in family reunification cases. She was a small woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense attitude that made me believe she could actually help me find a way back to my son. These cases are never simple, she warned me during our first meeting. Even when there's clear evidence of fraud, the courts prioritize the best interests of the child. In this case, Michael is 20 years old, so he's not technically a child anymore, but that also means he has the legal right to make his own decisions about contact. What are my options? I asked. Janet spread out several folders on her desk. First, we file a complaint challenging the original adoption on the grounds that your consent was obtained through fraud. That will create a legal record of what happened and might give us leverage to demand transparency from Guardian Family Services about their role in this. What about criminal charges? I asked. What Richard did was kidnapping, wasn't it? Possibly, Janet said carefully. But the statute of limitations has likely passed for most criminal charges, and proving criminal intent 20 years after the fact would be extremely difficult. Our best bet is to focus on your right to contact with your son, and his right to know the truth about his origin. Janet also recommended that I hire a private investigator to gather more information about the Sullivans and about Guardian Family Services, which appeared to have gone out of business several years earlier under circumstances that were, in her words, questionable. If this was part of a pattern of illegal adoptions, that could strengthen your case significantly, she explained. I hired the private investigator that afternoon, a former police detective named Tom Chen, who had experience with adoption fraud cases. Tom was quiet and methodical, and he didn't make promises he couldn't keep, which I appreciated after dealing with Richard's lies for so long. I'll need a few weeks to put together a complete picture, Tom told me, but based on what you've shown me, this doesn't look like an isolated incident. Guardian Family Services was involved in several adoptions during that time period that followed similar patterns. What kind of patterns? I asked. Young mothers told their babies had died or had severe disabilities, while healthy infants were placed with families willing to pay significant sums for private adoptions, Tom said. It was a lucrative business model until the state started investigating them in the early 2000s. That night I sat in my empty house and tried to imagine what my life would have looked like if I had been allowed to raise my son. I thought about first steps and first words, about school plays and baseball games, about teaching him to drive and helping him with homework and watching him grow into the young man I'd seen in those photographs. I thought about how different Richard and I might have been if we'd had a child to focus on instead of my grief and his guilt. We might have been a real family instead of two people living around a lie that grew bigger and more poisonous every year. But I also tried to be honest with myself about what those years would have been like. We had been young and financially struggling, and if Michael had needed expensive medical care, it would have been difficult. Richard hadn't been entirely wrong about that, even if his solution had been unforgivable. The Sullivans, from what I could tell from my internet research, were a well-established family with the resources to provide Michael with opportunities I might not have been able to give him. He was studying engineering at a good school, he looked healthy and happy in the photos I'd found, and it was clear that he had been loved and cared for. I didn't want to destroy that for him. I didn't want to be the birth mother who showed up after 20 years and demanded a relationship that would complicate his life, but I also couldn't live with the knowledge that my son was out there somewhere, believing I was dead, while I continued pretending he was dead too. There had to be a middle ground, a way to give him the truth without destroying the life he'd built with the people who had raised him. 2 weeks after I'd hired Tom, he called me with an update that made everything more complicated. I've been digging into the Sullivans' background, he said, and there's something you need to know. John Sullivan isn't just any adoptive father, he's Richard's cousin. I felt the phone slip in my hand. What? John Sullivan is the son of Richard's mother's sister, Tom continued. They grew up together, went to the same schools, stayed in touch over the years. This wasn't a random placement through an agency. This was Richard giving your son to his own family. The betrayal was so much deeper than I had imagined. Richard hadn't just stolen my son and given him to strangers, he had given him to his own cousin, which meant that for 20 years, Richard had been able to get updates about Michael's life, to see photos, to know exactly how he was doing while I grieved for a child I thought was dead. It also meant that somewhere in the Sullivan family, people knew the truth about Michael's origins. They knew that his birth mother was alive and grieving, and they had chosen to participate in Richard's deception. There's more, Tom said. I found records showing that Richard has been visiting Michael regularly for the past 5 years. Since Michael turned 15, Richard has been driving to Ohio at least once a month, sometimes more. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, staring at the wall and trying to process what I'd just learned. While I had been visiting an empty grave, Richard had been visiting our living son. He had watched Michael grow up, had been part of his life, had probably attended graduations and birthday parties, and all the milestones I'd missed. He hadn't just stolen my son, he had stolen 20 years of being a grandmother, an aunt, a family member. He had stolen Michael's right to know me, and my right to know him, while maintaining his own relationship with the boy he'd taken from me. The rage that filled me then was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. It was cold and clean and focused, and it gave me a clarity I hadn't had since this all began. I was going to get my son back, and I was going to make sure Richard faced consequences for what he'd done to both of us. When Richard showed up at the house that evening, trying once again to convince me to work things out, I was ready for him. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out about John Sullivan?" I asked him before he could even sit down. The color drained from his face. "Cindy, I can explain. Your cousin," I continued. "You gave our son to your cousin, and then you've been visiting him for years, while I thought he was dead." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I know about the monthly visits. I know you've been part of his life, while I've been visiting an empty grave. I know that you've watched him grow up and go to school and become a man while I've spent 20 years thinking I failed as a mother." Richard sat down heavily, looking like a man whose carefully constructed world was finally collapsing around him. "How could you do that to me?" I asked quietly. "How could you hold me while I cried for our son, knowing that you could pick up the phone and talk to him anytime you want?" "I thought I was protecting you," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him now. "You were protecting yourself," I said. "You were protecting yourself from having to admit what you'd done, from having to face the consequences of giving away our child without my consent." I pulled out a folder of papers Janet had prepared and set them on the table between us. "These are divorce papers," I said, "and these are the documents we're filing tomorrow to challenge Michael's adoption and demand contact. You can sign them voluntarily, or we can do this the hard way. But either way, your lies end now." Richard looked at the papers like they were a death sentence, which in a way, they were the death of the life he'd built on deception, the death of the marriage he'd maintained through betrayal, the death of the control he'd had over both my life and Michael's. "If you do this," he said quietly, "everything comes out. Everyone will know what I did. John and Helen will lose the son they've raised. Michael will discover that everything he's believed about his life is a lie. You'll destroy multiple families just to satisfy your need for revenge." "This isn't revenge," I said. "This is justice. This is a mother fighting to have contact with the son who was stolen from her. This is a 20-year-old man's right to know the truth about where he came from." Richard signed the papers that night, probably because he knew that fighting me would only make the situation more public and more painful for everyone involved. As I watched him write his name on document after document, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 20 years. I felt powerful. For 2 decades, I had been the victim of Richard's choices, the woman who couldn't have children, the wife who needed to be protected from harsh realities. Now I was taking control of my own story, and it felt like waking up after a 20-year coma. After Richard left that night, I called Janet to let her know we were ready to proceed. Then I called Tom to ask him to find the best way to approach Michael directly, in case the legal route took too long or didn't give me the outcome I needed. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Tom asked. "Once you make contact, there's no going back, even if it doesn't go the way you hope." I looked around my quiet house, at the life I'd built around a lie, at the empty spaces where my son should have been. I've been ready for 20 years, I just didn't know what I was getting ready for. That night, I wrote the first letter I'd ever written to my son. I didn't know if I'd ever have the courage to send it, but I needed to put my feelings into words, to practice what I would say if I ever got the chance to explain myself to him. Dear Michael, I wrote, my name is Cynthia Thompson, and I'm your birth mother. I know that sounds impossible, because you were told I died when you were a baby, but I've been alive and thinking about you every single day for 20 years. I need you to know that I never chose to give you up, that I was told you had died, and that discovering you were alive has been both the greatest joy and the greatest heartbreak of my life. I wrote for hours trying to capture 20 years of love and loss and hope in a way that wouldn't overwhelm or frighten him. I wanted him to understand that I wasn't trying to replace the parents who had raised him, but that I had always been his mother too, even when I didn't know where he was. When I finished writing, I folded the letter carefully and put it in an envelope with his name on it. Tomorrow the legal process would begin. Tomorrow I would start the fight to reclaim my place in my son's life. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, I fell asleep knowing that my son was alive somewhere in the world, and that soon, if I was brave enough and lucky enough, he would know that his mother was alive too. The next morning I woke up early and dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue dress that I hoped made me look professional and trustworthy rather than desperate or unstable. I wanted Michael to see me as someone worth knowing, not as a woman who had been broken by 20 years of deception. Janet met me at the courthouse, carrying a briefcase full of documents that would officially begin my fight to reconnect with my son. As we walked up the courthouse steps, I felt nervous but determined, like someone who was finally doing what she should have done years ago if she'd known it was possible. Today was the first day of the rest of my life as Michael's mother, and I was ready to fight for every day I'd lost, and every day we might still have together. Filing the legal papers felt like jumping off a cliff, but Janet assured me we had built a solid case. The courthouse clerk stamped our documents with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that made a 20-year injustice feel like just another Tuesday morning transaction. As we walked back to Janet's car, she explained what would happen next. Guardian Family Services will be served with papers demanding they turn over all records related to Michael's placement, she said, unlocking her car door. The Sullivans will receive notification that the adoption is being challenged, and will petition the court for your right to contact Michael directly. How long will all of this take? I asked, settling into the passenger seat. Months. Probably, Janet said honestly. Maybe longer if they fight us. But Tom is working on gathering evidence about other fraudulent adoptions from the same agency, and if we can prove this was part of a pattern, it'll strengthen our case significantly. I nodded, trying to prepare myself for a long battle. 20 years of deception wouldn't be undone overnight, no matter how much I wanted immediate resolution. When I got home, there was a message on my answering machine from Richard's brother David, asking me to call him back. I almost deleted it without listening to the whole thing, but something in his tone made me curious enough to pick up the phone. Cindy, I need to talk to you about what's happening with Richard, David said when he answered. Can you meet me for coffee this afternoon? David and I had always gotten along well during the years Richard and I were married. He was 3 years younger than Richard, more easygoing, and he'd often seemed puzzled by some of Richard's more controlling tendencies. If anyone in Richard's family might be sympathetic to my situation, it would be David. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls. David was already waiting when I arrived, looking tired and worried. He stood up when he saw me, offering an awkward hug that suggested he wasn't sure how to navigate this new dynamic between us. Richard told me what happened, he said after we'd ordered coffee. I had no idea, Cindy. I swear to you I had no idea what he'd done. I studied his face looking for any sign that he was lying, but David had never been good at deception. Unlike his brother, he wore his emotions openly, and right now he looked genuinely horrified. Did you know about John and Helen taking a baby 20 years ago? I asked. David nodded reluctantly. I knew they'd adopted a child around that time. John mentioned it at a family gathering, said they'd been chosen by a birth mother who wanted them to have her baby, but he never said anything about Richard being involved. And he certainly never mentioned that the birth mother thought the baby had died. So you knew Michael existed, but you didn't know he was my son. Right. David said, leaning forward across the table. Cindy, if I had known what Richard did to you, I would have told you immediately. What he did was monstrous. I believed him. David had always been the more honest of the two brothers, the one who couldn't keep secrets or tell convincing lies. It was one of the reasons his wife Sarah loved him, and one of the reasons Richard had always seemed slightly annoyed by him. Has Richard talked to you about what he's planning to do? I asked. David stirred his coffee nervously. He's scared, Cindy. Really scared. He knows he's going to lose everything over this, and he's talking about leaving town, maybe moving out west where he has some business contacts. Running away, I said. Of course he is. He asked me to talk to you about dropping the legal case. David continued. He thinks if you pursue this, it'll destroy Michael's relationship with John and Helen, and that's not fair to any of them. I felt my jaw clench. What about what's fair to me? What about what's fair to Michael, who has the right to know the truth about his origin? I told him the same thing, David said quickly. I told him he had no right to ask you to protect him from the consequences of what he'd done, but I also wanted to ask you something. As someone who cares about you both, I waited for him to continue. Are you sure you're ready for it? He asked gently. I'm not trying to talk you out of it, but once you open this door, everything changes for everyone involved. Michael might not react the way you're hoping. John and Helen might fight you. Richard might do something desperate to try to stop you. I looked out the window at the busy street, watching people go about their normal lives, while mine was being completely rebuilt from the ground up. David, I've spent 20 years grieving for a son who was alive. I've spent 20 years thinking I was a mother who lost her child, when the truth is that I was a mother whose child was stolen from her. I can't spend the rest of my life pretending I don't know the truth, just because it makes other people uncomfortable. David nodded slowly. I understand, and for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Michael deserves to know who you are, and you deserve the chance to have a relationship with your son. Thank you, I said, feeling some of the tension in my shoulders relieve. It helps to know that someone in Richard's family doesn't think I'm being vindictive or unreasonable. You're being a mother, David said simply. That's what mothers do. They fight for their children. After David left, I sat in the cafe for another hour, thinking about what he'd said about Richard planning to leave town. Part of me was relieved at the thought of not having to see him every day, but another part of me was furious that he might try to escape the consequences of what he'd done. I called Janet from the cafe and told her about Richard's possible plans to flee. We can ask the court to freeze his assets if we think he's trying to hide money or avoid paying damages, she said. But unless he's actually fleeing prosecution for a crime, we can't stop him from moving. What about his responsibility to provide testimony about what happened 20 years ago? I asked. We can subpoena him for depositions, but if he moves out of state, it becomes more complicated to enforce, Janet admitted. Let me look into what options we have. That evening, I drove past the hotel where Richard was staying, a mid-range business hotel near his office. His car was in the parking lot, and I could see lights on in what was probably his room. For a moment, I considered going up and confronting him about his plans to run away, but I realized there was nothing left to say between us. He had made his choices 20 years ago, and I was making mine now. If he wanted to spend the rest of his life running from what he'd done, that was his decision. My focus needed to be on moving forward, not on punishing him. The next morning, Tom called with an update that changed everything. I found something you need to see, he said. Can you meet me at my office this afternoon? Tom's office was in a converted warehouse downtown, a cramped space filled with filing cabinets and computer equipment. When I arrived, he had several folders spread out on his desk, along with what looked like old photographs and documents. I've been digging deeper into Guardian Family Services, he said, gesturing for me to sit down, and I found records of at least 12 other adoptions that followed the same pattern as Michael. Young mothers told their babies had died or had severe disabilities, while healthy infants were placed with families willing to pay substantial fees. He handed me a folder filled with photocopied documents. These are court records from a class action lawsuit filed against Guardian Family Services The agency was shut down, and several of its directors were charged with fraud. I opened the folder and started reading. The stories were heartbreakingly similar to mine. Women who had been told their babies were stillborn, only to discover years later that their children had been adopted by other families. Mothers who were convinced to give up babies with minor medical issues that were described as life-threatening disability. What happened to the people who were involved? I asked. Most of them served short prison sentences and paid fines, Tom said. But here's the interesting part. One of the directors, a woman named Margaret Chen, kept detailed records of all the adoptions, including information about the birth parents and adoptive families that wasn't supposed to be preserved. He handed me another folder. Margaret Chen died in 2018, but her estate included boxes of documents that were turned over to the state attorney general's office. I have a contact there who was able to pull Michael's file. My hands started shaking as I opened the folder. Inside was a complete record of Michael's adoption, including medical records I'd never seen, financial documents showing the payments Richard had made to Guardian Family Services, and most shocking of all, a psychological evaluation of me that had been done without my knowledge. They had me evaluated? I asked, staring at a document titled, Psychological Assessment of Birth Mother Cynthia Thompson. Apparently according to this report, you were deemed emotionally unstable and unsuitable for motherhood, based on observations made during your hospital stay after Michael's birth. I read through the evaluation, feeling sick to my stomach. The psychologist had described me as overly emotional, dependent on husband for decision-making, and likely to struggle with the demands of caring for a special needs child. The assessment was clearly designed to justify removing Michael from my care, and it was based on observations of a woman who was sedated and recovering from major surgery. I was barely conscious for the first few days after the surgery. I know, Tom said. That's what makes this so damning. They created a false psychological profile to justify taking your son, and then they used it to convince Richard that you wouldn't be able to handle raising Mike. I kept reading, and found something even more disturbing. The report included a recommendation that I not be told about Michael's placement with another family, because disclosure would likely result in severe psychological trauma and possible self-harm. They convinced Richard that telling me the truth would destroy me, I said quietly. It looks that way, Tom agreed, and based on some of the other documents in here, they used similar tactics with other birth fathers to convince them to cooperate with fraudulent adoption. I closed the folder, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the deception that had been orchestrated around my son's birth. It wasn't just Richard who had lied to me. There had been an entire network of people working together to separate mothers from their children, and they had used sophisticated psychological manipulation to make the fathers believe they were protecting their wives. Does this change our legal case? I asked. Absolutely, Tom said. This proves that your consent to the adoption was obtained through fraud, and it provides documentation of the criminal conspiracy that was involved. Janet is going to be very happy to see this. That afternoon, I met with Janet to go through the new evidence. Her reaction was even stronger than I'd expected. This is a smoking gun, she said, spreading the documents out on her conference table. Not only does it prove that the original adoption was fraudulent, but it shows that you were specifically targeted and manipulated as part of a criminal enterprise. What does that mean for Michael? I asked. It means we have grounds to petition the court for immediate contact, Janet said. We can argue that Michael has been the victim of kidnapping, essentially, and that he has the right to know about the criminal activity that separated him from his birth mother. Will the court really see it that way? With this evidence? Yes, Janet said confidently. Especially since Michael is now an adult who can make his own decisions about contact. The court can't force him to have a relationship with you, but they can certainly ensure that he's given the opportunity to know the truth. That evening I called David to let him know about the new evidence we'd discovered. He listened in silence as I described the fraudulent psychological evaluation and the criminal conspiracy that had been involved in Michael's adoption. Jesus, Cindy, he said when I finished. Richard really had no idea how deep this went, did he? I don't think so, I said. I think he was manipulated too in a way. But that doesn't excuse what he did to me and Michael for the past 20 years. No, it doesn't, David agreed. Have you thought about what you're going to do when you finally get to contact Michael? It was the question that kept me awake at night. I had spent so much energy focused on proving that I had the right to contact my son, that I hadn't fully considered what I would actually say to him when that moment came. I don't know, I admitted. How do you explain to someone that their entire life has been built on a lie? How do you tell a 20-year-old that his birth mother isn't dead, that his father participated in a criminal conspiracy, that the people who raised him were unknowingly part of a fraudulent adoption scheme? Maybe you start with the truth, David said. Maybe you tell him that you love him, that you've been looking for him his whole life without knowing he was alive to be found, and that you don't want to disrupt his life but you needed him to know that you exist. It sounded so simple when David said it, but I knew it would be the hardest conversation of my life. The next week brought a flurry of legal activity. Janet filed motions demanding immediate access to Michael, supported by the evidence Tom had uncovered about the criminal conspiracy. We also filed for an emergency hearing, arguing that Michael had the right to know about the fraud that had been perpetrated against both of us. The Sullivans' lawyer filed a response arguing that disrupting Michael's life with revelations about his adoption would be harmful to his emotional well-being, and that the statute of limitations had passed for challenging the adoption. They also claimed that John and Helen had acted in good faith, believing that they were adopting a child whose birth mother had genuinely consented to the placement. Reading their response, I felt a complicated mix of anger and sympathy. I was angry that they were trying to prevent Michael from learning the truth, but I also understood that they were trying to protect the son they had raised and loved for 20 years. From their perspective, I was a stranger trying to destroy their family based on events that had happened 2 decades ago. But from my perspective, I was a mother trying to reclaim the relationship with my son that had been stolen from me through fraud and criminal activity. Janet scheduled a meeting with the Sullivans' lawyer to see if we could reach some kind of agreement that would allow me to contact Michael without forcing a traumatic court battle. The meeting was set for Friday afternoon at Janet's office, and she warned me that it might be contentious. They're going to try to paint you as unstable or vindictive, she said. They'll argue that you're more interested in revenge against Richard than in Michael's well-being. You need to be prepared for that. I spent the week before the meeting practicing what I would say, trying to find words that would convey my love for Michael without making me sound desperate or unhinged. I wrote down key points I wanted to make, reminders about staying calm and focused on Michael's right to know the truth rather than on my own pain and anger. The night before the meeting, Richard called me. It was the first time I'd heard from him since he'd signed the divorce papers, and his voice sounded strained and exhausted. "Cindy, I need to ask you something," he said without preamble. "Are you really going to do this? Are you really going to destroy Michael's life just to get back at me?" "This isn't about you, Richard," I said. "This is about Michael's right to know where he came from." "He's happy," Richard said. "He has a good life. He's doing well in school. He has parents who love him. Why do you want to take that away from him?" "I don't want to take anything away from him," I said. "I want to give him something back. I want to give him the knowledge that his birth mother loved him, that she never chose to give him up, that she's been grieving for him his whole life." "What if he doesn't want to know you?" Richard asked. "What if learning the truth destroys his relationship with John and Helen? What if it makes him hate all of us for lying to him?" They were fair questions, and they reflected fears I'd been wrestling with since this whole process began. But I had come to believe that Michael deserved the truth, even if it was painful, even if it complicated his life. "Then that's his choice to make," I said, "but it should be his choice, not yours." Richard was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry, Cindy," he said finally. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am truly sorry for what I did to you." "I know you are," I said. "But sorry doesn't give me back 20 years with my son." After Richard hung up, I sat in my kitchen and thought about all the ways this situation could go wrong. Michael might reject me completely, angry about the disruption I was bringing to his life. John and Helen might refuse to allow any contact, forcing a bitter court battle that would traumatize everyone involved. The media might get hold of the story and turn it into a sensational tale about adoption fraud and family secrets, but I also thought about all the ways it could go right. Michael might be relieved to finally understand his origin. John and Helen might recognize that I wasn't trying to replace them, but simply to add another layer of love and support to Michael's life. The truth might be painful initially, but it might also bring healing and closure to a situation that had been built on deception. The meeting on Friday afternoon took place in Janet's conference room, a sterile space with fluorescent lighting and a long table that somehow made everything feel more formal and adversarial than I'd hoped. The Sullivans' lawyer was a woman in her 40s named Patricia Webb, who had the kind of polished professional demeanor that made me feel underdressed and unprepared. Janet introduced us and explained that the purpose of the meeting was to explore whether we could find a mutually acceptable way for me to make contact with Michael without resorting to a protracted court battle. My clients are willing to consider supervised contact, Patricia said, pulling out a folder of documents, but only after Mrs. Thompson undergoes a psychological evaluation to ensure that contact would be in Michael's best interests. I felt my face flush with anger. A psychological evaluation. I'm not mentally ill, I'm a mother who wants to meet the son who was stolen from her. Mrs. Thompson's emotional state is certainly understandable, Patricia said smoothly. But you have to understand that from my client's perspective, you're a stranger who is making dramatic claims about events that happened 20 years ago. They need assurance that contact with you won't be harmful to Michael. Janet leaned forward. Webb, we have extensive documentation proving that Mrs. Thompson's son was taken from her through criminal fraud. This isn't a case of an unstable birth mother trying to disrupt a legitimate adoption. This is a case of kidnapping and conspiracy. That's your interpretation of events, Patricia replied. My clients acted in good faith, believing that they were adopting a child whose birth mother had consented to the placement. They've raised Michael for 20 years and they've done an excellent job. He's a well-adjusted young man with a bright future, and they're concerned that revelations about his adoption could derail his progress. What about Michael's right to know the truth? I asked. What about his right to make his own decisions about whether he wants contact with his birth mother? Michael is free to seek out information about his birth parents if he chooses, Patricia said, but my clients see no reason to force that information on him if he hasn't expressed interest in it. The conversation continued for another hour, with both sides essentially restating their positions without finding any common ground. Patricia insisted that any contact had to be approved and supervised by John and Helen, while Janet argued that I had the right to contact Michael directly as his birth mother. Finally, Janet called for a break and pulled me into her private office. They're not going to budge, she said. They want to control every aspect of any potential contact, which essentially gives them veto power over your relationship with Michael. So what do? We go to court, Janet. We present our evidence about the criminal fraud, and we ask the judge to order that Michael be informed about his origins and given the opportunity to decide for himself whether he wants contact. How long will that take? Probably several more months, Janet said, honest. But based on the evidence we have, I think we'll win. That weekend I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of waiting for the court case to play out, I decided to write directly to Mike. Not to send the letter immediately, but to put my thoughts and feelings into words that I could refine and perfect over time. I spent Saturday afternoon at my kitchen table, writing draft after draft of a letter that somehow needed to convey 20 years of love and loss without overwhelming or frightening a young man who had no idea I existed. Dear Michael, I know this letter will come as a shock to you and I'm sorry for that. I wish there was a gentler way to tell you what I need you to know, but sometimes the truth is like ripping off a bandage, painful but necessary for healing to begin. I wrote about the day he was born, about how much I had wanted him, about the joy I had felt during my pregnancy and the devastation I had experienced when I was told he had died. I wrote about the empty grave I had visited every year, about the way his absence had shaped every day of my life since, about the love that had never died even when I thought he had. I wrote about discovering the truth, about the shock and anger and overwhelming relief of learning that he was alive. I tried to explain the legal battle I was fighting, not for revenge, but for the right to know my son and for his right to know his origin. Most importantly, I wrote about my hopes for the future. I tried to make it clear that I wasn't trying to replace John and Helen, that I wasn't expecting him to suddenly think of me as his real mother, that I simply wanted the chance to know him and to let him know that he had been loved by his birth mother from the moment he was conceived. Writing the letter was both cathartic and heartbreaking. It forced me to confront all the emotions I'd been carrying since discovering the truth about Michael, and it helped me clarify what I really wanted from this reunion. I didn't want to disrupt his life or damage his relationships with the people who had raised him. I simply wanted him to know that I existed, that I had never stopped loving him, and that I would be there for him in whatever capacity he was comfortable with. By Sunday evening, I had a letter that felt honest and loving, without being overwhelming. I folded it carefully and put it in an envelope with his name and address, but I didn't seal it. I wasn't ready to send it yet, but having it written made me feel more prepared for whatever came next. Monday morning brought news that changed everything. Tom called to tell me that he had located Michael's current address and phone number, and that he had some additional information about Michael's life that I might find interesting. He's not just studying engineering, Tom said. He's been volunteering at a local hospital, working with children who have heart defects. According to his social media posts, he's planning to specialize in biomedical engineering with a focus on developing better treatment options for congenital heart conditions. I felt tears forming in my eyes. My son, who had been taken from me because of his own minor heart condition, was dedicating his life to helping other children with similar problems. There was a beautiful symmetry to it that made me believe that somehow, despite everything that had happened, Michael had grown into exactly the person he was meant to be. There's something else, Tom continued. I found evidence that Michael has been asking questions about his adoption. He's been in contact with a genealogy service, trying to trace his biological family tree. It looks like he's been curious about his origins for at least the past year. This news filled me with hope. If Michael was already interested in learning about his birth family, then perhaps he would be more receptive to contact than John and Helen feared. What kind of questions has he been asking? I asked. Basic genealogy stuff, mostly. Tom's family medical history, ethnic background, that sort of thing. But he also submitted a DNA sample to one of those ancestry websites about 6 months ago. I felt my heart skip a beat. A DNA sample, yes. And here's the interesting part, Tom's. If you were to submit your own DNA sample to the same service, it would almost certainly show a match between you and Michael. It would prove beyond any doubt that you're his biological mother. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, thinking about this new development. If Michael was actively searching for information about his biological family, then perhaps I didn't need to wait for the court case to play out. Perhaps I could find a way to connect with him through the genealogy website, to let him discover the truth about his origins in a way that felt like his own choice rather than something being forced on him. That afternoon, I drove to a local pharmacy and bought a DNA testing kit. Following the instructions, I provided a saliva sample and filled out the paperwork to submit it to the same genealogy service Michael had used. According to the information packet, results would be available in 4 to 6 weeks. In the meantime, I could create a profile on the website and start building my own family tree, making myself available for contact if Michael was actively searching for biological relatives. Creating my profile felt like putting a message in a bottle and throwing it into the ocean, hoping it would somehow find its way to the right person. I uploaded a photo of myself and wrote a brief description that I hoped would be welcoming without being overwhelming. Hi, my name is Cynthia Thompson, and I'm searching for biological family members. I wrote. I'm particularly interested in connecting with a son who was born in March 2003 and was adopted through Guardian Family Services. If you think we might be related, I would love to hear from you. I also created a family tree that included information about Michael's biological grandparents, medical history, and ethnic background, all the information I thought he might be looking for in his own genealogy research. Then I waited, checking the website obsessively for any sign that someone had viewed my profile or sent me a message. The waiting was almost unbearable. Every day that passed without contact felt like another day stolen from the relationship I was trying to build with my son. But I also knew that this approach gave Michael control over the timing and nature of our first contact, which felt more respectful than having information about his adoption forced on him through a court order. 2 weeks after I submitted my DNA sample, I received an email notification that my results were ready. With shaking hands, I logged into the website and navigated to the DNA matches section. At the top of the list, marked as a close family match, was a profile for someone named Sullivan. The estimated relationship was listed as parent-child, and the confidence level was 99. I had found my son, and more importantly, I had found him in a way that would allow him to find me when he was ready. I clicked on Sullivan's profile, my heart pounding as I read the limited information he had shared. His profile picture showed the same young man I had seen in the photographs Tom had found, but this was a more recent image. He was smiling, wearing a university sweatshirt, and he looked happy and confident. His family tree was sparse, showing only the Sullivan family line and a few distant relatives. There was no information about his biological parents, which suggested that he hadn't yet discovered the match between us. I had two choices. I could send him a message through the website, revealing myself as his biological mother and explaining everything I knew about his adoption. Or I could wait for him to discover the match himself and let him make the first move. After everything I had been through, waiting felt impossible. But I also recognized that Michael deserved the chance to process this information at his own pace, without pressure from me. I decided to wait 1 week. If he didn't contact me within 7 days of the DNA results being posted, I would send him a message. It was a compromise that honored both my desperate need to connect with him and his right to discover the truth in his own time. That week was the longest week of my life. I checked the genealogy website multiple times every day, looking for any sign that Michael had logged in and seen our DNA match. I drafted and redrafted the message I would send him if he didn't contact me first, trying to find words that would convey the truth without overwhelming him. On day 6, I received a message notification from the website. With my heart in my throat, I clicked on it and saw that it was from M. Sullivan. "Hi," the message read. "I think our DNA results show that we're related, but I'm not sure how to interpret the data. The website says we're a close family match, possibly parent and child, but that doesn't make sense to me because I was adopted and I was told my birth parents died in an accident. Could there be some kind of mistake with the testing? I'd appreciate any information you can share about how we might be connected." I stared at the message for a long time, reading it over and over again. My son was reaching out to me, confused and looking for answers about his origin. This was the moment I had been dreaming of and preparing for, but now that it was here, I felt terrified of saying the wrong thing. I spent the rest of the day crafting my response, writing and rewriting it, until I had something that felt honest and loving without being overwhelming. "Dear Michael," I wrote, "thank you for reaching out to me. I know this must be confusing for you, and I wish I could give you simple answers, but the truth about our connection is complicated and probably very different from what you've been told about your adoption." I went on to explain that I was his biological mother, that I had been told he died shortly after birth, and that I had only recently discovered he was alive. I tried to convey my love for him while also acknowledging that this revelation would probably be shocking and possibly upsetting. "I want you to know that I'm not trying to disrupt your life or replace the parents who raised you," I continued. "I'm simply grateful to finally know that you're alive and well, and I'm hoping that we might be able to get to know each other even if it's slowly and carefully." I ended the message by giving him my phone number and email address, and by telling him that I would respect whatever level of contact he was comfortable with. After I sent the message, I sat in my kitchen and cried. Not from sadness, but from relief and hope and overwhelming love for the son I was finally getting the chance to know. Now all I could do was wait for his response and pray that 20 years of separation hadn't destroyed the possibility of building a relationship with the child I had never stopped loving. Michael's response came 3 days later, and it was longer than I had expected. I was sitting at my desk checking my email for the 100th time that day. When I saw his name in my inbox, my hands trembled as I opened the message. "Mrs. Thompson," he wrote, I've been thinking about your message for days, and I honestly don't know what to believe. What you're telling me contradicts everything I've known about my life, but the DNA results don't lie. I've done some research on Guardian Family Services, and I found articles about the fraud investigations. I think I need to hear more of the story before I can process what this all means. He went on to explain that he had always wondered about his birth parents, especially since he had some medical questions that his adoptive parents couldn't answer. He said that John and Helen Sullivan were wonderful parents who had given him every opportunity in life, but that he had always felt like there was a missing piece to his identity. If what you're saying is true, he continued, then my entire understanding of my origins has been built on lies. That's hard to accept, but it also explains some things that never quite made sense to me. I'd like to talk to you on the phone if you're willing. I have a lot of questions. He included his phone number and suggested that we could talk that weekend when he didn't have class. Reading his message, I felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that he was willing to hear me out, and terror that I might say something wrong and lose this precious opportunity to connect with him. I called Janet immediately to tell her about Michael's message. This is the best possible outcome, she said. If Michael initiates contact himself, it undermines any argument the Sullivans might make about you forcing unwanted communication on him. Should I tell him about the legal case we're pursuing? I asked. Not yet, Janet advised. Let him process the basic facts about his adoption first. Once he understands what happened, he can decide for himself whether he wants to support our efforts to hold the responsible parties accountable. That Saturday morning, I sat by the phone for 20 minutes before I found the courage to dial Michael's number. When he answered, his voice was deeper than I had imagined, with a slight accent that must have come from growing up in Ohio. Mrs. Thompson? He said. Please, call me Cindy, I said, my voice barely steady. Thank you for being willing to talk to me. I have to admit, I'm pretty confused about all of this, Michael said, but I've been curious about my birth parents my whole life, so I guess I'm ready to hear whatever you have to tell me. I had rehearsed this conversation in my head dozens of times, but now that the moment was here, all my carefully planned words seemed inadequate. Instead, I found myself speaking from the heart. Michael, the first thing I want you to know is that I loved you from the moment I knew I was pregnant, I said. Losing you was the most devastating thing that ever happened to me, and finding out that you're alive has been both the greatest joy and the greatest heartbreak of my life. I told him about his birth, about the complications with the emergency surgery, about waking up to be told that he had died. I explained how Richard had handled all the arrangements while I was recovering, how I had never seen his body or attended a funeral, how I had spent 20 years visiting what I thought was his grave. Michael listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or disbelief. When I finished explaining the basic facts, there was a long silence. So my father, he said finally, the man who was supposed to be my father, he knew I was alive this whole time. Yes, I said quietly. And he's been visiting you regularly for the past several years. Wait, what? Michael's voice rose in surprise. Someone's been visiting me. Who? I realized that Michael didn't know about Richard's relationship to the Sullivans, or about the regular visits. From his perspective, his birth father was just as dead as his birth mother was supposed to be. Richard Thompson is your biological father, I said, and John Sullivan is his cousin. Richard has been visiting you as part of the extended Sullivan family for years. You probably know him as Uncle Rich. The silence that followed this revelation lasted so long that I started to worry that Michael had hung up. Uncle Richard, he said finally, his voice flat with shock. Uncle Richard is my biological father. Yes, I said. I'm so sorry, Michael. I know this is a lot to process. He's been at every birthday party since I turned 15, Michael said, his voice getting stronger with anger. Every Christmas, every graduation. He brought me a gift when I got accepted to college. He's been part of my life this whole time, and he never said anything. I think he was afraid, I said, though I wasn't sure why I was defending Richard. I think he convinced himself that telling the truth would hurt everyone involved. Hurt everyone? Michael's voice was rising now. What about hurting you? We've both been living lies because he was too much of a coward to admit what he'd done. I could hear the pain and anger in Michael's voice, and my heart ached for him. This was exactly what I had feared, that learning the truth would devastate him and destroy his sense of security about his own life. Michael, I said gently, I know this is overwhelming. We don't have to figure everything out in one conversation. No, I need to understand this, he said. I need to know exactly what happened and why. Can you tell me more about Guardian Family Services? What kind of fraud were they involved in? I spent the next hour explaining everything Tom had discovered about the fraudulent adoption ring, the fake psychological evaluations, the pattern of telling birth mothers that their babies had died while placing healthy infants with families willing to pay substantial fees. Michael asked detailed questions about the timeline, about the legal evidence we had discovered, about how many other families had been affected. His questions were intelligent and methodical, and I could hear the engineering student in the way he approached the problem. So this wasn't just about me, he said, when I finished explaining. This was a systematic criminal operation that destroyed multiple families. That's right, I said. You and I were both victims of the same crime, and John and Helen, Michael said quietly. They were victims too, weren't they? They thought they were adopting a baby whose birth mother had chosen them. Yes, I said, grateful that he was able to see the complexity of the situation. I don't think John and Helen did anything wrong. They were lied to just like we were. Michael was quiet for a moment. What do you want from me? He asked finally. I mean, what are you hoping will happen now that we've found each other? It was the question I had been dreading, because I wasn't sure I could articulate what I wanted without sounding desperate or demanding. I want to know you, I said honestly. I want to hear about your life, your interests, your plans for the future. I want to know what kind of person you've grown up to be. But I also want you to know that I'm not trying to replace John and Helen, or to claim some kind of parental authority that I haven't earned. What about Richard? Michael asked. What's going to happen to him? I'm divorcing him, and we're pursuing legal action to hold him accountable for his role in the fraud. But that's separate from my relationship with you. You can have whatever relationship with him you want, regardless of what I decide to do. I don't think I want any relationship with him, Michael said, his voice hard. I trusted him. I thought he cared about me as his cousin's son, but the whole time he was just, keeping tabs on the kid he stole from his wife. I think it was more complicated than that, I said, though I wasn't sure why I kept defending Richard. I think he genuinely cares about you, even though what he did was unforgivable. Maybe, Michael said, but I don't think I can ever look at him the same way again. We talked for another hour about lighter topics. Michael told me about his studies, his volunteer work at the hospital, his plans to pursue a master's degree in biomedical engineering. I told him about my job as a librarian, my hobbies, the small details of my daily life that I hoped would help him understand who I was as a person. When we finally ended the call, Michael said he needed time to process everything we had discussed, but that he wanted to continue talking. We agreed to speak again the following weekend, and he asked if I would send him some photos from when he was a baby, if I had any. That evening, I went through boxes of old photographs that I had saved from Michael's brief time in the hospital. There weren't many, just a few pictures Richard had taken during my pregnancy, and one blurry photo of Michael in the NICU that a nurse had given me before I was told he had died. Looking at that photo now, I could see that he had been a beautiful, healthy baby, despite his minor heart condition. There was nothing in his appearance that suggested he was dying or suffering from severe disabilities. He looked like any other newborn, perfect and full of potential. I scanned the photos and sent them to Michael via email, along with a message explaining when and where each picture had been taken. I also included a photo of myself from around the time he was born, so he could see what I looked like when I was his biological mother, rather than the middle-aged woman he was getting to know now. Michael's response came the next morning. Thank you for the photos, he wrote. It's strange to see pictures of myself as a baby that I've never seen before. I look healthy in that hospital photo. Whatever complications they told Richard about, They couldn't have been very serious. He also sent me some recent photos of himself, including pictures from his volunteer work at the hospital and from various college events. Seeing him grown up and happy was both wonderful and heartbreaking. I was proud of the man he had become, but I was also acutely aware of all the years of his life that I had missed. Over the next few weeks, Michael and I developed a routine of talking on the phone every few days and exchanging emails regularly. He told me about his childhood with John and Helen, about his friends and interests, about his dreams for the future. I shared stories about my family history, his biological grandparents, and the medical information he had been curious about. Gradually, I began to understand what kind of person my son had grown up to be. He was thoughtful and analytical, with a strong sense of justice and a genuine desire to help people. His work with children who had heart defects was clearly motivated by his own early medical challenges, and he spoke passionately about developing new technologies that could improve treatment outcomes. He was also deeply loyal to John and Helen, whom he clearly loved and respected. He made it clear that learning about his biological parents hadn't diminished his feelings for the people who had raised him, but it had helped him understand some things about himself that had always been mystery. I always wondered why I was so interested in medical technology, he told me during one of our phone calls. John and Helen are both teachers, and none of their relatives work in healthcare. But knowing about my early heart problems, and knowing that you work in medical research, it makes more sense. I was confused by this comment. I don't work in medical research, I said. I'm a librarian. Really? Michael sounded surprised. Richard told me that my birth mother had been a medical researcher who died in a car accident. He said that's probably where my interest in biomedical engineering came from. This was another lie that Richard had told, another layer of deception designed to explain away inconvenient questions. Even in creating a false story about my death, he had tried to maintain some connection between Michael's interests and his origins. No, I've been a librarian my whole career, I said, but your grandfather, my father, was a doctor. Maybe that's where your interest in medical technology comes from. What kind of doctor was he? Michael asked. A cardiologist, I said. He specialized in treating children with congenital heart defects. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice filled with wonder. My grandfather was a pediatric cardiologist, he said, and I'm planning to specialize in developing better treatments for children with heart defects. It seems like more than a coincidence, I agree. Do you think, Michael said, hesitantly, that maybe we could meet in person sometime? I mean, if you want to. I'm starting to feel like talking on the phone isn't enough. My heart jumped at the suggestion. I had been hoping he would want to meet, but I hadn't wanted to pressure him by bringing it up myself. I would love that, I said. When would work for you? I have spring break coming up in a few weeks, Michael said. I could drive down to see you, if that's okay. Of course it's okay, I said. You can stay here if you want, or I can get you a hotel room, whatever you're comfortable with. I think a hotel might be better for the first visit, Michael said. I mean, no offense, but this is all still pretty new for me. No offense taken, I said. I want you to feel comfortable. After we hung up, I called Janet to tell her about Michael's plan to visit. This is excellent news, she said. If Michael is willing to meet with you and build a relationship, it completely undermines any argument that contact between you would be harmful to him. What about the legal case? I asked. Should I tell him about the lawsuits we're pursuing? I think it's time, Janet said. He's clearly processing the information well, and he has a right to know that there are legal options for holding the responsible parties accountable. During our next phone call, I explained to Michael about the legal actions we were pursuing against Guardian Family Services' former directors, and against Richard for his role in the fraud. We're not just seeking financial damages, I explained. We're trying to establish legal precedents that will make it harder for this kind of fraud to happen to other families in the future. Michael was interested in the legal details, asking questions about the evidence we had gathered, and the likelihood of success. When I finished explaining our strategy, he was quiet for a moment. I want to help, he said finally. If my testimony would be useful, I'm willing to provide it. Are you sure? I asked. It could be emotionally difficult, and it might put you in conflict with Richard and possibly with John and Helen. I've already talked to John and Helen about everything, Michael said. They're devastated to learn about the fraud, and they're angry at Richard for lying to all of us. They support whatever I decide to do about the legal case. I felt a wave of relief hearing that John and Helen weren't trying to prevent Michael from having a relationship with me or from participating in the legal proceeding. I had been worried that they would see me as a threat to their family, but it sounded like they were more concerned with supporting Michael through a difficult situation. What about Richard? I asked. Have you decided whether you want to confront him about what he did? I'm not ready for that yet, Michael said. I'm still too angry. Maybe after we meet in person, and I have a better understanding of the whole situation, I'll be able to talk to him, but right now I just feel betrayed. That's completely understandable. You don't owe him anything, including forgiveness. 2 weeks before Michael's planned visit, Richard called me again. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up the phone. Cindy, I need to talk to you about Michael, he said without preamble. John called me and told me that Michael knows the truth. He said Michael doesn't want to see me anymore. Can you blame him? I asked. I know I deserve his anger, Richard said, but I'm hoping that maybe you could help me understand how to make this right with him. I felt a surge of disbelief. You want me to help you repair your relationship with our son, after you stole him from me and lied to both of us for 20 years. I know how that sounds, Richard said quickly, but I do love Michael. Cindy. I know I have no right to ask for your help, but I don't know how else to reach him. Maybe you should start by taking responsibility for what you did, I said. Maybe you should admit that you were wrong and stop trying to justify your actions. I have admitted I was wrong, Richard. I've told John and Helen everything, and I've told Michael that I'm sorry. Sorry isn't enough, I said. You didn't just make a mistake, Richard. You committed a crime. You stole our son and let me grieve for him for 20 years while you maintained a relationship with him. I know, Richard said quietly. I know what I did was unforgivable, but he's still my son too, and I don't want to lose him completely. Then you should have thought about that before you decided to give him away, I said, and hung up. The conversation with Richard left me feeling drained and angry. Even now, faced with the consequences of his actions, he was still primarily concerned with protecting himself and maintaining his own relationships. That evening I called Michael to tell him about Richard's call. He called you asking for help in reaching me, Michael said, his voice incredulous. That's unbelievable. I told him that if he wanted to repair his relationship with you, he needed to start by taking full responsibility for what he did. I said, I'm not ready to forgive him. Michael said, maybe someday, but not now. Right now, I just want to focus on getting to know you and understanding my real history. That's exactly what we should focus on. I agreed. The week before Michael's visit, I found myself in a strange state of nervous excitement. I cleaned my house obsessively, planned meals that I hoped he would like, and tried to prepare myself mentally for meeting my son face to face for the first time since he was 3 days old. I also spent time thinking about what I wanted to say to him, what stories I wanted to share, what aspects of our family history I thought would be most meaningful to him. I gathered photo albums and family documents, medical records that might be useful for his own healthcare, and small mementos from his early childhood that I had saved without really knowing why. The night before his arrival, I barely slept. I kept imagining different scenarios for how our meeting might go. Would we recognize each other immediately? Would there be an awkward moment when we didn't know how to greet each other? Would he be disappointed when he saw me in person? Michael called that morning to let me know he was leaving Ohio and expected to arrive around dinner time. His voice sounded nervous but excited, which made me feel a little better about my own anxiety. I spent the day making his favorite meal, or at least what I thought might be his favorite meal based on our conversations. I had learned that he liked Italian food, so I made lasagna from scratch and bought ingredients for a salad and garlic bread. I also bought a bottle of wine, then remembered that he was only 20 and put it back in the cabinet. At 5 o'clock I heard a car pull into my drive. I looked out the window and saw a young man getting out of a small sedan, looking around at my house with what appeared to be curiosity rather than nervousness. He was taller than I had expected, probably close to 6 feet, with dark hair and the same green eyes I saw in the mirror every morning. He was wearing jeans and a college sweatshirt, and he moved with the confident stride of someone who was comfortable in his own skin. I opened the front door before he could knock, and for a moment we just stood there looking at each other. "Hi," he said finally, with a smile that was both shy and warm. "Hi," I said back, feeling tears forming in my eyes. "You look just like your grandfather. And you look like the woman in the hospital photo," he said. "Just older." We both laughed, and the awkwardness of the moment dissolved. Without really thinking about it, I opened my arms, and he stepped forward into a hug that felt both natural and surreal. He was solid and real and warm, and he smelled like soap and coffee and something that was uniquely him. For 20 years I had imagined what it would feel like to hold my son, and the reality was both exactly what I had hoped for, and completely different from anything I could have prepared myself for. When we broke apart, he was smiling. "It's good to finally meet you in person." "It's good to finally meet you too," I said. "Come in, please. I made dinner." As Michael stepped into my house, I felt like I was experiencing a moment that existed outside of normal time. This was my son, grown up and healthy and whole, walking into the home I had built around the absence of him. The reality of his presence transformed everything familiar into something new and miraculous. "This is a nice house," he said, looking around at the living room. "It feels comfortable." "Thank you," I said. "Are you hungry?" "I made lasagna." "That sounds great," he said. "I've been driving for 6 hours, so I'm definitely ready for a real meal." As we sat down to dinner, I found myself studying his face, trying to memorize every detail. He had Richard's nose and chin, but his eyes and the shape of his face were definitely mine. His expressions were completely his own, though the result of 20 years of experiences I hadn't shared. "This is really good," he said, after his first bite of lasagna. "Did you make it from scratch?" "I did," I said. "I wasn't sure what you liked, so I just guessed." "You guessed well," he said. "Helen makes good lasagna too, but this is different. More herbs, I think." Hearing him mention Helen so naturally reminded me that this wasn't just a reunion between us. It was a complex situation involving multiple families and relationships that had been built on both truth and lies. "How are John and Helen handling all of this?" I asked. Michael considered the question while he chewed. "They're being amazing about it, honestly. They were shocked when I first told them what I'd learned, but once they understood what had happened, they were just focused on supporting me." "They must be worried about how this will affect your relationship with them," I said. "I think they were at first," Michael said. "But I've made it clear that finding out about you doesn't change how I feel about them. They're my parents. They raised me. They love me. And I love them. Learning about my biological origins doesn't diminish that." "I'm glad you feel that way," I said. "I never wanted to come between you and the people who gave you a good life." "You couldn't if you tried," Michael said simply. "There's room in my life for all of the people who care about me." After dinner we moved to the living room, and I showed him the photo albums and documents I had gathered. He looked through pictures of his grandparents, asking questions about their lives and personalities. He was particularly interested in learning about my father's work as a cardiologist. "He would have been so proud of what you're doing," I told him. "He always said that helping children with heart defects was the most rewarding work he could imagine." "Do you think he would have been involved in my care if I had stayed with you?" Michael asked. "Absolutely. He would have made sure you had the best possible treatment, and he probably would have spent hours explaining your condition to you as you got older." Michael smiled at this. "I would have liked that. I've always been curious about the medical side of things." As the evening progressed, I found myself relaxing into the conversation. Michael was easy to talk to, intelligent and thoughtful, with a sense of humor that reminded me of my father. Despite the unusual circumstances of our reunion, being with him felt natural in a way that surprised me. Around 10 o'clock, Michael said he should probably head to his hotel and get some rest. "Would you like to have breakfast tomorrow?" I asked. "There's a nice cafe downtown that I think you'd enjoy." "I'd like that," he said. "What time?" "Whatever works for you," I said. "I'm just happy to have more time together." As he gathered his jacket and keys, Michael turned to me with a serious expression. "Thank you," he said, "for fighting to find me, for not giving up, for being willing to go through all the legal complications, just to have the chance to know me." "Thank you for being willing to know me," I said. "I know this situation isn't easy for anyone involved." "No, it's not," he agreed, "but I'm glad it's happening. I feel like I'm finally understanding who I am in a way that I never could before." After he left, I sat in my living room, surrounded by the photo albums we had looked through together, feeling a profound sense of completion. For 20 years I had carried an ache in my chest where my love for my son had lived with no place to go. Now finally I had been able to share that love with the person it belonged to. Michael was everything I had hoped he would be and more. He was kind and intelligent and grounded, with a clear sense of purpose and a generous heart. John and Helen had done a wonderful job raising him, and I was grateful to them for giving him the stable, loving childhood that I might not have been able to provide when I was young and struggling financially. But I was also grateful to finally have the chance to be part of his life, to share the family history and medical information he had been curious about, to offer him another source of love and support as he built his adult life. The next morning, Michael and I met for breakfast at the cafe I had suggested. Over coffee and pancakes, we continued the conversation we had started the night before, but this time we talked more about the future than the past. "I've been thinking about the legal case you mentioned," Michael said. "I want to do whatever I can to help, but I also want to make sure that John and Helen don't get caught up in any legal problems." "Janet assured me that John and Helen are not at risk," I said. "They were victims of the fraud just like we were. If anything, they might be entitled to some kind of compensation for the emotional distress they've experienced." "What about Richard?" Michael asked. "What kind of consequences is he likely to face?" "That depends on several factors. The criminal statute of limitations has probably passed for most charges, but he could face civil liability for his role in the conspiracy. He might also face professional consequences if his business partners or clients find out what he did." Michael was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "I know I should feel sorry for him," he said finally, "but I don't. What he did was so selfish and cruel that I can't bring myself to feel sympathy for whatever consequences he faces." "You don't have to feel sorry for him," I said. "You don't owe him forgiveness or understanding. You're allowed to be angry about what he did to both of us." "Are you angry?" Michael asked. "I mean, I know you must be, but how are you dealing with it?" I considered his question carefully. "I'm angry about the years we lost," I said. "I'm angry about the lies and the manipulation and the way he let me grieve for a child who was alive and well. But I'm also trying not to let that anger consume me, because I don't want it to interfere with the relationship we're building now." "That's probably healthier than how I'm handling it," Michael said. "Right now I'm just furious with him. Every time I think about all the family gatherings where he acted like my concerned uncle while knowing he was my biological father, I get so angry I can barely think straight." "That anger is justified," I said, "and you don't have to let go of it until you're ready to. Just don't let it eat you alive." We spent the rest of the morning walking around downtown, looking at shops and talking about lighter topics. Michael told me about his college friends, his favorite classes, his plans for graduate school. I told him about my work at the library, my hobbies, the quiet life I had built around the absence of him. When it was time for him to drive back to Ohio, we stood beside his car in my driveway, neither of us quite ready to say goodbye. "This has been wonderful," he said. "I'm so glad I came." "I'm glad you came too," I said. "When do you think you might be able to visit again?" "Maybe in a few weeks," he said. "I'd like to bring John and Helen next time, if you're okay with that. I think they'd like to meet you." "I would love to meet them," I said. "Honestly, I'd like to thank them in person for taking such good care of you." Michael hugged me goodbye, and this time it felt less like a stranger's embrace and more like the hug of someone who was becoming an important part of my life. "I'll call you when I get back to school," he said. "Drive safely," I said, "and thank you for giving me the chance to know you." After he drove away, I went back into my house and sat in the kitchen, where we had shared our first meal together. The reality of what had happened over the past few days was beginning to sink in. I had found my son, and more importantly, he had found. We had built the foundation of a relationship that could grow and develop over time. For the first time in 20 years, I felt like a mother again. Not just someone who had given birth to a child, but someone who had a living, breathing relationship with her son. It was different from the relationship I would have had if I had raised him from birth, but it was real and meaningful and full of potential. The fight to find Michael had taken everything I had, but it had given me back the most important thing I had ever lost. Now I had to figure out how to build a life that included him, while also dealing with the ongoing legal battle and the wreckage of my marriage to Richard. But for today, it was enough to know that my son was alive and well and willing to know me. Everything else could wait. 3 weeks after Michael's visit, I received a call from Janet with news that would change everything about our legal strategy. She sounded more excited than I had ever heard her. "Cindy, you need to get down to my office immediately," she said. "Tom found something that's going to blow this case wide open." I drove to Janet's office with my heart racing, wondering what new evidence could possibly be more damning than what we already had. When I arrived, Tom was sitting at the conference table with several boxes of documents spread out in front of him, wearing the expression of someone who had just solved a particularly complex puzzle. "Tell her what you found," Janet said, settling into her chair with barely contained enthusiasm. Tom pulled out a thick folder and opened it carefully. "I've been tracking down other victims of Guardian Family Services, and I found a woman named Patricia Hendricks, whose story is almost identical to yours. Her daughter was supposedly stillborn in 2004, but she recently discovered that the child was actually placed with a family in Pennsylvania." "That's horrible," I said, "but how does it help our case?" "Patricia kept detailed records of everything," Tom continued, "including recordings of phone conversations she had with Richard." I felt my stomach drop. Recordings of Richard. Apparently, Patricia became suspicious about her daughter's death and started investigating on her own about 10 years ago. She managed to track down Richard's phone number and called him, pretending to be a journalist writing about adoption fraud. Richard thought he was speaking off the record, and he admitted to his involvement in multiple fraudulent adoptions. Tom pressed play on a small digital recorder, and Richard's voice filled the room, tinier than I remembered but unmistakably his. "The whole operation was more sophisticated than people realized," his recorded voice said. "We weren't just targeting random women. We specifically looked for young mothers who were emotionally vulnerable, financially unstable, or dealing with medical complications that could be exaggerated." I listened in horrified fascination as Richard described the criminal enterprise he had been part of, explaining how Guardian Family Services had identified prospective birth mothers and systematically manipulated them into giving up their children. "The psychological evaluations were key," Richard's voice continued. "We could always find a way to make the mother seem unfit or unstable, especially if she was dealing with postpartum depression or medication from surgery. Then we'd convince the father that placement was in everyone's best interest." "How many cases were you involved in?" Patricia's voice asked on the recording. "Directly? Maybe 8 or 10 over the years, but the agency handled dozens of similar situations. It was incredibly lucrative. Families would pay $50,000 or more for a healthy infant, and we could arrange the whole thing in a matter of days." Janet stopped the recording. "There's more," she said. "Richard admits to falsifying medical records, bribing hospital staff, and creating fake death certificates. This isn't just adoption fraud anymore, Cindy. This is conspiracy, forgery, bribery, and probably several other felonies." I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I had just heard. I had known that Richard was guilty of lying to me and participating in Michael's illegal adoption, but I hadn't understood the full scope of his criminal activity. He hadn't just made a desperate decision about our son. He had been a professional criminal who had destroyed multiple families for profit. "What does this mean for our case?" I asked. "It means we can pursue criminal charges," Tom said. "The statute of limitations hasn't expired for conspiracy and fraud charges related to the other cases Richard was involved in, and it means we have evidence of a pattern of criminal behavior that goes far beyond what happened to you and Michael." Janet leaned forward. "It also means that Richard is looking at serious prison time if this goes to trial. That gives us enormous leverage in negotiations." "What kind of negotiation?" We can offer to keep his involvement in the other cases quiet in exchange for his full cooperation in your case, Janet explained. He provides complete testimony about what happened with Michael's adoption, admits his guilt publicly, and agrees to substantial financial compensation. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease. Part of me wanted Richard to face the full consequences of his crimes, but another part of me worried about how a high-profile criminal case would affect Michael and the Sullivan family. What does Michael think about all of this? I asked. I haven't told him yet, Janet said. I wanted to discuss our options with you first, but he's going to find out eventually, and he deserves to know that his biological father was involved in a much larger criminal enterprise. That evening I called Michael to tell him about the new evidence. He listened without interrupting as I explained about the recordings and the other victims of Guardian Family Services. So, Richard wasn't just a desperate father making a bad decision, Michael said when I finished. He was a career criminal who made money by stealing babies from their mother. That's what it looks like, I said quietly. Michael was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was cold with anger. I want him prosecuted, he said. I want him to face criminal charges for what he did to all of those families. Are you sure? I asked. A criminal trial would be very public, and it might be difficult for you and for John and Helen. I don't care, Michael said firmly. If we don't hold him accountable, he might do this to other families. How many other women are out there right now, visiting graves of children who are actually alive and being raised by other people? His words hit me like a physical blow. I had been so focused on my own situation that I hadn't fully considered the possibility that Richard's criminal activity might still be ongoing. You're right, I said. We have to stop him. The next morning I called Janet and told her that Michael and I wanted to pursue criminal charges against Richard. She scheduled a meeting with the district attorney's office for later that week. Meanwhile, I had to prepare for something I had been both anticipating and dreading. John and Helen Sullivan had arranged to visit me the following weekend, along with Michael. It would be the first time I met the people who had raised my son, and I wasn't sure how to prepare for such a complex emotional encounter. I spent the week cleaning my house obsessively and planning meals that I hoped would be appropriate for the occasion. I also spent a lot of time thinking about what I wanted to say to John and Helen, how to express my gratitude for the love and care they had given Michael, while also acknowledging the painful circumstances that had brought us all together. On Friday evening, my phone rang. It was John Sullivan, calling to confirm the plans for their visit. Mrs. Thompson, he said, his voice formal but not unfriendly. I wanted to make sure tomorrow was still convenient for you. Please, call me Cindy, I said. And yes, I'm looking forward to meeting you both. I have to admit, this is a difficult situation for all of us, John said. Helen and I are grateful that you're willing to meet with us, but we're also nervous about how to navigate this conversation. I'm nervous too, I admit, but I think it's important for all of us to talk, especially for Michael's sake. That's exactly how we feel, John said. Michael is our primary concern and we want to make sure that whatever relationship develops between you and him is healthy for everyone involved. His words were diplomatic, but I could hear the underlying protectiveness in his voice. He was making it clear that while he was willing to meet me, his loyalty was to Michael and to the family they had built together. I appreciate that, I said. I want you to know that I'm not trying to disrupt the family you've created, or to claim some kind of parental authority that I haven't earned. I'm just grateful for the chance to know Michael and to be part of his life in whatever way feels right to him. We appreciate that, John said, and I could hear some of the tension leave his voice. We'll see you tomorrow around noon. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, which seemed appropriate for such an emotionally charged day. I made coffee and tried to calm my nerves by reviewing what I wanted to say to John and Helen, but I found it impossible to concentrate on anything other than the approaching meeting. At exactly noon, I heard a car pull into my drive. Through the window I could see Michael getting out of the passenger seat of a blue sedan, followed by a couple who had to be John and Helen Sullivan. John was a tall, thin man with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He moved with the careful precision of someone who was used to being in control of situations. Helen was shorter and rounder, with curly brown hair and a warm smile that was somewhat offset by the worry lines around her eyes. They looked like exactly what they were: respectable, middle-class people who had devoted their lives to raising and loving their son. They also looked nervous and slightly overwhelmed by the situation they found themselves in. I opened the door before they could knock, and for a moment we all stood there looking at each other, unsure of how to begin this unprecedented interaction. "Hello," I said finally. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for inviting us," Helen said, stepping forward with her hand extended. "I'm Helen, and this is my husband John." We shook hands formally, and I invited them into the living room. Michael hung back slightly, clearly feeling the awkwardness of the situation as much as the rest of us. "Can I get anyone coffee or tea?" I asked, grateful for something concrete to do. "Coffee would be nice," John said, settling carefully onto the couch. "Thank you." I busied myself in the kitchen for a few minutes, using the time to compose myself and gather my thoughts. When I returned with a tray of coffee and cookies, I found John and Helen sitting stiffly on the couch while Michael perched on the edge of an armchair, looking like he was ready to mediate a negotiation. "I know this is awkward for everyone," I said, settling into my own chair. "I'm not sure there's any normal way to handle a situation like this." "No, there really isn't," Helen said with a nervous laugh. "But we felt it was important to meet you, especially after hearing so much about you from Mike. He's told us about your conversations and your visit," John added. "It's clear that you care about him very much." "Well, I do," I said simply. "I've cared about him every day for 20 years, even when I thought he was dead." Helen's eyes filled with tears at this, and she reached for a tissue from her purse. "I can't imagine what that must have been like for you," she said softly. "To lose a child and then discover that he was alive all along. It must have been devastating." "It was," I said, "but finding Michael has been the greatest joy of my life. And I want you to know how grateful I am to you both for giving him such a wonderful childhood. He's grown into an amazing young man, and that's because of the love and care you provided." John and Helen exchanged a look, and some of the tension in the room seemed to ease. "We love him very much," John said. "He's been the center of our lives since he came to us as a baby, and we want to continue being part of his life." Helen added, a note of anxiety creeping into her voice. "We're worried that learning about his biological family might change his feelings about us." "I've told them that's not going to happen," Michael interjected. "But I think they need to hear it from you too." I looked directly at John and Helen, wanting them to understand exactly how I felt about their role in Michael's life. "I would never want to diminish your relationship with Michael," I said. "You are his parent. You raised him, you loved him, you gave him everything he needed to become the person he is today. I'm not trying to replace you, or to claim that biology is more important than the bonds you've built with him." "Then what are you looking for?" John asked. "What kind of relationship do you want with Michael?" It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself since the day I discovered Michael was alive. "I want to know him," I said honestly. "I want to share family history with him, medical information, stories about his grandparents. I want to be someone he can talk to, someone who cares about his life and his future. But I want that to happen in a way that adds to his life rather than complicating it. Like an aunt or a family friend," Helen said, and I could hear relief in her voice. "Something like that," I agree. "Someone who loves him and is interested in his life, but who respects the fact that you are his parents." We talked for another hour about practical matters. How often might I visit or call? Would I be included in family celebrations? How would we handle holidays and other special occasions? The conversation was sometimes awkward, but it was also productive. We were all trying to figure out how to blend our lives in a way that would work for everyone, especially Michael. During lunch, the conversation became more relaxed. John and Helen told me stories about Michael's childhood, his interests and achievements, his personality quirks, and the challenges they had faced as parents. I shared stories about my own family, about Michael's grandparents and cousins, about the medical history that might be relevant to his future healthcare. Michael seemed more comfortable as the afternoon progressed, laughing at stories about his younger self and asking questions about relatives he had never known existed. It was clear that he was relieved to see that the adults in his life could coexist peacefully and focus on his well-being rather than on their own competing claims to his loyalty. "There's something else we need to discuss," I said when we had finished eating. It's about Richard and the legal case we're pursuing. The mood in the room shifted immediately. John's expression became guarded, and Helen reached for Michael's hand. What about Richard? John asked carefully. I explained about the new evidence Tom had discovered, about the recordings that proved Richard's involvement in a larger criminal conspiracy, about the possibility of pursuing criminal charges. We found out that Richard wasn't just involved in Michael's adoption. He was part of a criminal enterprise that separated multiple families through fraud and deception. John and Helen listened in shocked silence as I described the scope of Richard's criminal activity. My God, Helen said when I finished. We had no idea it was anything like that. When Richard first approached us about adopting Michael, he made it sound like a private arrangement with a young woman who couldn't care for her baby. That's exactly what he was supposed to make it sound like. The whole operation was designed to make the adoptive families believe they were helping everyone involved. What does this mean for us? John asked. Are we going to be implicated in this criminal investigation? No, I said quickly. You were victims of the fraud just like Michael and I were. You acted in good faith, believing that you were participating in a legal adoption. But our adoption of Michael, Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper, is it still legal? Could we lose him? The fear in her voice was heartbreaking. These people had raised Michael for 20 years, and now they were discovering that their entire family had been built on criminal fraud. The adoption itself can't be undone, I said gently. Michael is legally your son, and nothing can change that. But the fraud that was involved in arranging the adoption is still a crime that needs to be prosecuted, and you want to pursue criminal charges against Richard, John said, more as a statement than a question. Yes, not just for what he did to our family, but for what he did to all the other families who were victimized by this conspiracy. John and Helen exchanged another look, and I could see them having a silent conversation about how to respond. We understand why you want to pursue this, Helen said finally, and we'll support whatever decision you and Michael make, but we're worried about how a public criminal trial might affect Michael. I've thought about that too. But Michael feels strongly that Richard should be held accountable, and I think he's right. If we don't stop this kind of criminal activity, other families could be victimized. Then we'll deal with whatever comes, John said firmly. Michael's welfare is our primary concern, but justice is important too. As the afternoon wound down, I found myself feeling more optimistic about the future than I had since this whole situation began. John and Helen were good people who clearly loved Michael and wanted what was best for him. They weren't trying to prevent me from having a relationship with him, and they weren't trying to avoid the difficult task of dealing with the criminal fraud that had brought us all together. When they prepared to leave, Helen hugged me warmly. Thank you for being so understanding about our role in Michael's life, she said. This could have been much more difficult if you had tried to assert some kind of legal claim to him. He's your son, I said simply. I would never try to take that away from you. John shook my hand and thanked me for my hospitality, but I could tell that he was still processing everything we had discussed. The revelation about Richard's criminal activities had shaken him, and he was probably wondering what other aspects of Michael's adoption might have been built on lies. Michael lingered after his parents had gotten into their car. That went well, he said, seeming relieved. I was worried there might be more tension. They're good people, I said. They love you, and they want to protect you. I can't fault them for that. They were scared that you were going to try to take me away from them, Michael said. I told them that wasn't what you wanted, but I think they needed to hear it from you. I hope they believe me, I said, because it's the truth. I'm not trying to undo 20 years of your life. I'm just grateful to be part of the rest of it. Michael hugged me goodbye, and I watched as he got into the car with John and Helen. As they drove away, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about my relationship with Michael anymore. It was about creating a new kind of extended family that could acknowledge the painful circumstances of our origins while still focusing on love and support for the future. The following week, Janet and I met with the district attorney to discuss criminal charges against Rich. The DA, a serious woman in her 50s named Rebecca Martinez, reviewed our evidence carefully and asked detailed questions about the other victims Tom had identified. This is clearly a case worth pursuing, she said when we finished our presentation. But I want to make sure you understand what you're getting into. A criminal trial will be public and potentially traumatic for everyone involved, including Michael. We understand that, but we also understand that Richard is still out there, and he might victimize other families if he's not stopped. Actually, Rebecca said, we have reason to believe that Richard's criminal activity didn't end 20 years ago. We've been tracking suspicious adoption-related financial transactions involving several people who worked with Guardian Family Services, and Richard's name has come up in our investigation. I felt my blood run cold. Are you saying he's still stealing babies from their mother? We don't have proof of that yet, Rebecca said carefully, but we have evidence that he's been involved in financial transactions related to private adoptions, as recently as last year. Janet and I exchanged shocked looks. I had assumed that Richard's criminal activity was part of his past, something he had done when he was younger and more desperate. The possibility that he was still actively destroying families was almost too horrible to contemplate. What can we do to help you build a case against him? I asked. The recordings you provided are excellent evidence for the historical cases, Rebecca said, but if we're going to stop his current activities, we need more recent evidence. Would you be willing to help us gather that? What do you mean? Janet asked. We'd like Ms. Thompson to contact Richard and try to get him to admit to recent criminal activity, Rebecca explained. With appropriate recording equipment and legal supervision, of course. The idea of deliberately contacting Richard and pretending to have a normal conversation with him made me feel sick. But if it could prevent other families from experiencing what Michael and I had been through, I knew I had to consider it. What would I have to do? I asked. Nothing dramatic, Rebecca said. Just call him and express concern about the legal case. Maybe suggest that you're worried about what other evidence might surface. If he's still actively involved in adoption fraud, he might reveal information that could help us stop him. That evening, I called Michael to tell him about the district attorney's request. They want you to spy on Richard, he said, sounding incredulous. They want me to help gather evidence that could prevent him from victimizing other families. If he's still stealing babies from their mothers, don't we have an obligation to stop him? Michael was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said finally, we do. But I'm worried about what this might do to you emotionally. Pretending to have a civil conversation with him after everything he's done to us. I'm worried about that too, I admit, but I keep thinking about all the other women who might be out there right now, believing their children are dead when they're actually alive and being raised by other families. Then you should do it, Michael said, and I'll support you however I can. The next week, Rebecca's office set up a meeting to plan the operation. They provided me with a small recording device and coached me on what kinds of questions to ask that might prompt Richard to reveal incriminating information. The key is to sound worried but not accusatory, the detective assigned to the case explained. You want him to think you're on his side, that you're concerned about protecting him from the legal consequences of past actions. We scheduled the call for the following Friday evening. I spent the week practicing what I would say, trying to prepare myself mentally for hearing Richard's voice, and pretending that I cared about his welfare. When Friday arrived, I sat in Janet's office with the recording equipment set up and the detective monitoring the call. My hands were shaking as I dialed Richard's number. Cindy, he said when he answered, sounding surprised. Is everything okay? I'm fine, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I was just calling because I'm worried about you. The lawyers have been asking a lot of questions about Guardian Family Services, and I'm concerned about what they might find. What kind of questions? Richard asked, and I could hear wariness in his voice. Questions about other adoptions you might have been involved in, I said. They seem to think there might be other families who were affected by what happened with Guardian Family Services. Richard was quiet for a moment. There might be, he said finally, but those situations were different. The families I've worked with recently have been completely lethal. My heart started racing. He had just admitted to recent involvement in adoptions. Recently? I asked, trying to sound casual. I thought you were done with all of that after what happened with Michael. I thought I was too, Richard. But there are still families out there who need help, Cindy. Young women who can't care for their babies, couples who desperately want children. I've been able to facilitate some connections, completely legally this time. How many families? I asked. Just a few over the past couple of years, Richard said. Maybe 3 or 4 placements, but everything has been above board, I promise. The detective made a hand signal, encouraging me to press for more details. I'm sure it has been, but I'm worried that the investigators might not see it that way, especially given what happened in the past. They won't find anything suspicious, Richard said confidently. I've been very careful to follow all the legal requirements this time. We talked for another few minutes before I ended the call, claiming that I needed to get to another appointment. When I hung up, the detective was smiling. That was perfect, he said. He admitted to recent involvement in multiple adoptions, and his claim that everything was legal this time suggests that he knows his past activities were illegal. Rebecca called me the next morning to tell me that Richard's admissions, combined with the other evidence they had been gathering, were enough to justify a full criminal investigation. We're going to execute search warrants on his home and office tomorrow, she said, and we're preparing arrest warrants based on the evidence you've helped us gather. What happens next? I asked. If we find what we expect to find in his records, Richard will be arrested and charged with multiple felonies related to adoption fraud, conspiracy and possibly kidnapping, Rebecca said. The trial will probably take place within the next year. I hung up the phone feeling a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. For months I had been focused on finding Michael and building a relationship with him. Now I was about to become a key witness in a criminal case that could send my ex-husband to prison for years. That evening, I called Michael to update him on what was happening. They're arresting Richard tomorrow, he said. If the search warrants turn up what they expect to find, I said. How do you feel about that? Michael asked. I considered his question carefully. I feel like justice is finally being served, I said. Not just for us, but for all the families he's destroyed over the years. And I feel like my biological father is about to become a convicted felon, Michael said quietly. I'm sorry, I said. I know this is complicated for you. It is, Michael admitted. But it's also necessary. If he's still destroying families, then he needs to be stopped. The next morning, I was drinking coffee in my kitchen when Janet called to tell me that Richard had been arrested at his office. The search warrants had uncovered extensive records of recent adoption-related activities, including financial transactions and correspondence that suggested ongoing criminal behavior. He's being charged with conspiracy, fraud, and trafficking in persons, Janet said. The trafficking charge is because he was involved in transporting children across state lines as part of fraudulent adoptions. I felt a chill hearing the word trafficking. I had known that Richard was a criminal, but hearing him described in the same terms used for people who traffic in human beings made the full scope of his crimes feel even more horrifying. What happens now? I asked. There will be a preliminary hearing within the next few weeks, Janet said, and you'll probably be called to testify at the trial. That afternoon, Michael called to tell me that Richard's arrest had been reported in the local news. The story doesn't mention me specifically, he said, but it talks about fraudulent adoptions involving families in Ohio. I'm worried that people are going to figure out that I'm one of the victims. How do you feel about that? I asked. Scared, Michael said. Honestly, I've never had my personal business be public like this, and I'm worried about how it will affect John and Helen. Have you talked to them about it? Yes, and they're being supportive, Michael said. But I can tell they're worried too. They've lived their whole lives as a normal private family, and now they're going to be associated with a criminal case. Over the next few weeks, the story of Richard's arrest and the broader adoption fraud conspiracy became a major news story in our area. Reporters called my house regularly, asking for interviews about my experience as a victim of the fraud. I declined most of the requests, but I did agree to speak with one reporter who was writing a comprehensive story about the impact of adoption fraud on families. The interview was emotionally difficult, but I felt it was important to help people understand how this kind of crime affects real families. I talked about the 20 years I had spent grieving for a son who was alive, about the complex process of building a relationship with Michael, about the importance of holding criminals like Richard accountable for their actions. When the article was published, it generated a lot of attention. I received letters and emails from other people who had been affected by adoption fraud, some of whom were just beginning to suspect that their own situations might not have been what they seemed. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a woman named Sandra Williams, who had given birth to twins in 2005 and been told that both babies had died due to complications from premature birth. After reading my story, she had started investigating her own situation and discovered evidence that suggested her twins might still be alive. I called Sandra and spent hours talking with her about her experience and about the resources available for people investigating potential adoption fraud. By the end of our conversation, she had decided to hire her own investigator and pursue legal action. "Reading your story gave me hope," she told me. "If you could find your son after 20 years, maybe I can find my daughters too." The thought that my experience might help other families reunite with their stolen children gave me a sense of purpose that I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about my own family anymore, it was about creating awareness and resources that could help other victims of adoption fraud. Meanwhile, Michael and I continued building our relationship despite the stress of the ongoing criminal case. He visited me again during his spring break, and I drove to Ohio to attend one of his engineering competitions. The more time we spent together, the more natural our relationship felt. I also developed a friendship with John and Helen, who proved to be generous and welcoming despite the difficult circumstances that had brought us together. They invited me to Michael's birthday celebration and included me in family gatherings when my schedule allowed. It wasn't the family I had imagined when I was pregnant with Michael 20 years ago, but it was a family nonetheless. We were all connected by our love for him and our commitment to supporting his future, even though we had arrived at that connection through the most painful possible circumstances. As Richard's trial date approached, I found myself feeling both anxious and determined. I wanted him to face the full consequences of his crimes, but I also wanted the trial to be over so that Michael and I could focus on building our future, rather than relitigating our past. The preliminary hearing took place on a gray Monday morning in March. I sat in the courtroom with Janet, watching as Richard was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles. He looked older and thinner than when I had last seen him, and he avoided making eye contact with me. The prosecutor presented a summary of the evidence against Richard, including the recordings Patricia Hendricks had made, the recent admission he had made to me, and the documents that had been seized from his office. The defense attorney argued that the charges were based on events that had happened decades ago, and that Richard was no longer involved in any criminal activity. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, and set a date for jury selection in June. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt a sense of completion that had been building for months. Richard would face trial for his crimes, and regardless of the outcome, the truth about what he had done was now part of the public record. Other families who had been victimized by adoption fraud would know that they weren't alone, and that legal recourse was possible. Most importantly, Michael and I had found each other despite Richard's efforts to keep us apart. We had built a relationship based on honesty and mutual respect, and we had created a new kind of family that honored both his origins and the people who had raised him. The trial would be difficult, but it was no longer the most important thing in my life. The most important thing was the future I was building with my son, and no criminal trial could take that away from us. Richard's trial lasted 2 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming: recordings, documents, testimony from multiple victims. I testified about 20 years of grief for a son who was alive. Michael testified about the betrayal and lies. The jury found Richard guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. After the trial, Michael graduated college with honor. I moved to Baltimore to be closer to him during graduate school. We discovered he had a twin sister, Jennifer, also stolen by the same fraud ring. Our family grew to include John, Helen, Jennifer, and her adoptive parent. Michael became a biomedical engineer specializing in pediatric heart defects, honoring his grandfather's legacy. He married Sarah and started his career helping children with conditions like his own. I became an advocate for adoption fraud victims, helping other families reunite. The pain of losing 20 years with my son transformed into purpose, protecting other families from the same devastating crimes. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.